Curtis Warren wasn't just any criminal. He was Britain's most dangerous drug lord. A man who rose from the gritty streets of Liverpool to build a multi-million-pound empire that stretched across Europe. But how did a boy from Toxteth become one of the most feared figures in the drug trade, and what led to his spectacular downfall? This is the story of power, ambition, and the price of a life lived outside the law. Curtis Warren was born in the heart of Liverpool's Toxteth district in the early 1960s, a place known more for its crumbling buildings and street gangs than for opportunity. Life in Toxteth was hard. Poverty wasn't just common, it was normal. Most kids had two options: stay out of the way, or get involved. Curtis chose the latter. From a young age, he showed a sharp mind and a quiet confidence that made him stand out. He wasn't the biggest or the loudest, but people listened when he spoke. That quiet power would follow him for the rest of his life. By the time he was a teenager, Curtis was already involved in street-level crime. He started off stealing car radios, then selling knockoff clothes and dodgy electronics from the back of a van. He knew how to hustle, but he also knew how to avoid drawing too much attention. While others around him chased quick money and ended up in jail, Curtis played the long game. He took mental notes on how local gangs operated, who controlled the ports, and how drugs moved through the city. His real education wasn't at school. It was on the streets, and he was a top student. It didn't take long for him to realize that petty crime would only get him so far. He saw dealers getting rich, driving flash cars and wearing gold chains, but he also saw them getting arrested or shot. He understood early on that if he wanted to survive, he had to be smarter than everyone else. He couldn't just be a dealer. He had to be the one supplying them. He kept his profile low and his ambitions high. While others were fighting over street corners, Curtis was already thinking about supply lines, international contacts, and large-scale operations. Even as a teenager, he saw himself not as a criminal, but as a businessman operating outside the law. That mindset would guide his every move. Curtis Warren wasn't born into power. He built it, one calculated decision at a time, and it all started in Toxteth. Among the broken homes and back alleys of a city that created one of Britain's most feared and fascinating crime figures. Curtis Warren's rise from small-time street hustler to serious criminal began with one bold decision. He moved from petty theft and local scams to drug trafficking. The shift wasn't sudden, it was strategic. During the early 1980s, Liverpool was becoming a key entry point for drugs arriving from overseas, especially cannabis from North Africa. Curtis saw the opportunity and knew it was his way into the big leagues. He wasn't interested in dealing bags on corners, he wanted control of the supply chain. He understood that the real money wasn't made on the streets, it was made at the source. His first major operation involved smuggling cannabis from Morocco into the UK. The route was risky, but potentially lucrative. He used freight containers, hidden compartments in vehicles, and even fishing boats to move the product. Curtis wasn't just moving kilos, he was moving tons. The profits from a single successful shipment could set a man up for life. But Curtis didn't spend the money on watches or women. He reinvested it into expanding his network, making contacts in Spain, Holland, and beyond. Every deal, every risk was part of a much bigger plan. He kept his organization tight. No one knew more than they needed to. He recruited smart, loyal people who understood silence was more valuable than greed. There were no flashy meetings, no unnecessary exposure. Everything was compartmentalized. Curtis stayed one step removed from the street-level chaos, building a structure that could survive arrests or raids without collapsing. At the same time, he was careful with his public image. He didn't flaunt his wealth or provoke police attention. To outsiders, he looked like just another quiet, successful businessman. But behind the scenes, his influence was growing rapidly. By his mid-20s, he was supplying cannabis to major cities across the UK and Europe. He didn't just build a drug operation, he built a network. Curtis's ability to stay invisible while pulling the strings made him nearly untouchable. While rivals fought over scraps, he was building an empire. His early success with cannabis wasn't the peak, it was just the foundation. The real prize and the real danger was still ahead, and Curtis Warren was more than ready to take the next step. As Curtis Warren's cannabis empire grew, so did his ambition. He had already proven he could outsmart local gangs and move drugs on a massive scale, but he wanted more money, more power, more reach. By the late 1980s, he set his sights on the most profitable and dangerous drug of all, cocaine. But to control that trade, he needed a new base of operations, one that gave him easier access to international smuggling routes and offered more protection from British law enforcement. The answer was the Netherlands, and more specifically, Rotterdam. Rotterdam was Europe's busiest port, and its sprawling docks were a dream for any smuggler. Containers came in from South America, Africa, and Asia by the thousands every day. With the right connections and a bit of cash, anything could slip through unnoticed. Curtis moved to the Netherlands and began embedding himself into the local underworld. He built ties with Turkish, Colombian, and Dutch traffickers, creating a pipeline for cocaine that started in the jungles of South America and ended in the clubs and council estates of Europe. But he didn't just rely on brute force or violence. Curtis operated like a businessman, negotiating prices, managing logistics, and keeping detailed records using coded messages and fake names. He used burner phones and constantly changed locations to stay ahead of police surveillance. Every part of his operation was designed for one thing: invisibility. Authorities didn't even know who was behind the growing cocaine flood across the UK. By the time they figured it out, Curtis was already several steps ahead. The scale of his cocaine shipments shocked even seasoned investigators. He wasn't importing kilos, he was bringing in hundreds of them at a time. A single container could be worth tens of millions of pounds on the street, and unlike many crime bosses, Curtis didn't depend on others to launder his money. He set up offshore companies, bought property under false identities, and used legitimate businesses as fronts. From his new base in Rotterdam, Curtis Warren became one of the most powerful drug traffickers in Europe. He had the contacts, the structure, and the discipline. But his success came at a cost. The more he grew, the more attention he attracted. And in the shadows, law enforcement had begun to take notice. Curtis Warren's operations in Rotterdam marked a turning point. No longer just a British drug trafficker, he had become a major international figure. With direct connections to South American cartels and European distributors, he was moving cocaine, heroin, ecstasy, and cannabis across borders with military precision. His network spanned continents, and the money flowing in was staggering. He was no longer dealing in millions. He was accumulating hundreds of millions. But Curtis remained disciplined. While others in his position flaunted their wealth, he kept a low profile, carefully managing his image and maintaining strict control over his inner circle. His ability to operate quietly made him all the more dangerous. Associates rarely met him directly. Orders were passed through trusted lieutenants using coded language, and money was moved through a labyrinth of shell companies and offshore accounts. He didn't just avoid the spotlight, he seemed to vanish into the background. To police across Europe, the drugs were real, the money was real. But the man behind it all remained a mystery. Curtis's empire reached deep into cities across the UK and mainland Europe. Liverpool, London, Manchester, Glasgow, Amsterdam, Paris, and Berlin all became hubs for his product. He established supply chains that could survive arrests and seizures. If one route was compromised, another was already in place. His organization operated like a multinational corporation, with logistics, finance, enforcement, and communications all carefully managed. Yet power breeds risk. The larger the operation grew, the harder it became to stay invisible. Rival gangs began to feel threatened by his dominance. Some tried to cut into his territories, others tried to undercut his prices. Violence started to creep into his world, not from him, but from those trying to challenge him. Curtis, ever the strategist, avoided direct confrontations. Instead, he used fear and reputation. Everyone knew what happened to those who crossed him, even if no one could prove it. Despite his success, cracks had started to form. The complexity of his network meant there were more moving parts, more people who could make mistakes. And although Curtis had always been careful, he was now operating in a world where one careless word or one wrong phone call could unravel everything. His empire was still growing, but so was the attention from those determined to bring him down. In 1996, after years of flying under the radar, Curtis Warren's empire faced its first real threat. Despite his careful methods and strict communication protocols, one small slip would change everything. Dutch authorities, working alongside international law enforcement, had been quietly monitoring suspected drug traffickers in the Netherlands. Curtis had avoided detection for years, but during a covert investigation, a single phone call caught their attention. It was brief, cryptic, and laced with coded language, but investigators suspected it was linked to a massive cocaine deal. They didn't know it yet, but they had finally found a thread to pull. That call led to surveillance. Warren's movements were tracked. His meetings were monitored. Authorities tapped phones, followed cars, and watched his properties. He had always taken precautions, but the net was tightening. Then came the breakthrough. Intelligence pointed to an incoming cocaine shipment worth tens of millions. The deal had been months in the making, involving contacts in Colombia and Turkish intermediaries based in the Netherlands. Curtis, confident as ever, flew into The Hague to finalize the final stages. He had done this 100 times before, but this time, the police were waiting. He was arrested in a Dutch hotel room. With him were several mobile phones, handwritten notes in code, and false identification documents. It was a rare moment of vulnerability. The man who had spent years staying one step ahead of the law had finally been caught red-handed. News of his arrest spread quickly. British tabloids dubbed him Britain's Pablo Escobar. His face, once unknown to the public, was suddenly splashed across newspapers and television screens. People were stunned, not just by his capture, but by the scale of his operation. Authorities estimated his personal fortune to be well over 100 million pounds, hidden across multiple countries. In custody, Curtis remained calm. He spoke little, revealed nothing, and acted as though he still held the upper hand. And in many ways he did. Even behind bars, his network kept running. Associates continued moving product, and loyal contacts managed his money. He seemed unfazed by the charges, but law enforcement had no intention of letting him slip away this time. The arrest was only the beginning. What followed would be the unraveling of one of the most elusive drug empires in European history. After serving time in the Netherlands, Curtis Warren was extradited to the UK, where authorities hoped to finally dismantle what remained of his empire. But Warren stayed tight-lipped. He refused to cooperate, refused to hand over his assets, and refused to admit defeat. Even stripped of his freedom, his reputation remained intact. Some believed he still had millions hidden away. Others whispered that he was quietly rebuilding, waiting for the right moment to strike again. For a while, he kept a low profile, but behind the scenes, another plan was already in motion, a plan that would draw him back into the spotlight. In 2007, intelligence agencies picked up chatter suggesting Warren was involved in organizing a new drug shipment. This time, the destination wasn't a major city or a European port. It was the quiet island of Jersey, isolated, wealthy, and far from the mainland's criminal networks. Jersey seemed like an unusual choice, but for Warren, it was a strategic move. The island had less competition, fewer eyes, and high demand. He allegedly began plotting the importation of a large cannabis load worth over $1 million. Unknown to him, the authorities were already watching. The operation, codenamed Operation Koala, was one of the most intensive surveillance missions ever conducted on the island. Over several months, officers used wiretaps, secret recordings, and aerial surveillance to track every move made by Warren and his associates. They listened to coded conversations. They followed vehicles. They recorded meetings in parks and pubs. Every piece of the puzzle was enforcement officials and curious members of the public. For many, it was the moment they had been waiting for. the chance to see one of Britain's most feared criminals finally face justice in full view. Warren, as always, remained calm. Dressed smartly and carrying himself with quiet confidence, he showed no sign of panic. But behind the calm exterior, the pressure was building. The prosecution presented a mountain of evidence. Intercepted phone calls revealed coded conversations about gear and the load. Surveillance footage showed Warren meeting with associates in secluded areas, passing notes and discussing logistics. Phone records placed him at key locations during critical points in the conspiracy. Authorities had spent months gathering data, and now they laid it all out, piece by piece, methodically destroying any claim of innocence. What made this case especially powerful was the level of detail. The operation had been tracked from start to finish, every move, every call, every meeting. The jury wasn't being asked to guess. They were being shown a complete story. And at the center of it all was Curtis Warren, directing the operation with the same cold precision that had once made him untouchable. The defense argued that the evidence was circumstantial, that Warren had no drugs in his possession, and that he had long since moved on from his criminal past. They painted him as a man who had already paid his debt to society, a target of overzealous law enforcement desperate for a win. But it wasn't enough. The evidence was simply too strong. After a long and closely followed trial, the verdict came: guilty. Warren was sentenced to 13 years in prison. But the legal battle wasn't over. The court also issued a confiscation order demanding that he repay nearly £200 million believed to be the profits of his criminal empire. When Warren refused, the court added another 10 years to his sentence. It was the most crushing blow he had ever faced. Not just prison, but the systematic dismantling of everything he had built. The empire that once seemed untouchable was now being taken apart piece by piece. And this time, there would be no escape. Life behind bars was nothing new to Curtis Warren, but this time, everything had changed. He was no longer the invisible kingpin quietly pulling strings from the shadows. Now, he was a high-profile inmate under constant surveillance, housed in one of the UK's most secure prisons. Every phone call was monitored, every visit recorded, and every movement tracked. The prison authorities weren't just watching him, they were determined to isolate him from the outside world completely. For the first time in decades, Curtis Warren was cut off from the empire he had once controlled. The restrictions were severe. He was banned from using the internet, denied access to mobile phones, and prohibited from contacting former associates. Even his mail was screened. Officials feared he might still be giving orders or attempting to rebuild his network, and they had reason to be cautious. Warren had a history of running operations from inside prison walls. This time, they weren't taking any chances. But the damage had already begun. With Warren behind bars and his communication lines severed, his criminal network began to fracture. Some associates tried to take over his territories, others disappeared or were arrested. Infighting broke out as loyalty gave way to greed. Without his leadership, the empire that had once stretched across Europe started to crumble. His rivals moved in quickly, seizing routes and connections he could no longer protect. Meanwhile, law enforcement agencies across Europe ramped up efforts to trace and seize his hidden fortune. Properties in Spain and Turkey were investigated. Offshore accounts were frozen. Cars, homes, and safety deposit boxes were confiscated. Millions were recovered. But authorities believed it was only a fraction of what he had earned. Still, Warren refused to cooperate. He wouldn't admit where the rest was. And with each refusal, the clock on his prison sentence kept ticking upward. Inside his cell, Warren remained largely silent. He didn't give interviews, didn't write a book, and didn't ask for sympathy. To those who watched him rise and fall, it was a quiet but stubborn resistance. Even as his empire collapsed and his fortune vanished, he refused to break. But isolation was its own punishment, and Curtis Warren, once Europe's most powerful drug lord, now lived in a world where power, respect, and influence were no longer within reach. Over time, Curtis Warren became more than just a criminal. He became a legend. Stories about him spread far beyond Liverpool, reaching other cities, countries, and even continents. To some, he was a master strategist, a man who built a drug empire from nothing and stayed ahead of the law for decades. To others, he was a symbol of ruthless ambition, willing to do whatever it took to succeed. Books, documentaries, and TV shows began to explore his life, each offering a different take. Some portrayed him as a clever businessman navigating a dangerous world. Others painted him as a violent criminal, whose greed brought destruction to countless lives. But behind the myths and headlines, truth was far more complicated. Curtis was neither a hero nor a villain in the simple way people wanted to see him. He was a man shaped by his environment, driven by a desire to escape poverty and claim power in a world that had little to offer him. His success wasn't luck. It was the result of careful planning, discipline, and an unyielding will to survive. He understood the risks and accepted the costs. He was smart enough to build a network that could operate across borders, but not smart enough to escape the attention of law enforcement forever. Despite his fearsome reputation, Curtis rarely showed open violence himself. He relied on intimidation, loyalty, and reputation to keep control. Those who crossed him vanished, but there was little evidence directly linking him to murders or attacks. His strength was in control, not chaos. Yet, as his empire grew, so did the cracks. Running a vast international network meant trusting many people, and trust could be broken. Informants, rival gangs, and law enforcement slowly chipped away at his operations. Each arrest, each betrayal, weakened the foundation. In the end, Curtis Warren's story is a cautionary tale, a reminder that crime, no matter how cleverly managed, carries consequences. His empire rose on secrecy and fear, but fell through exposure and pressure. The man who once seemed untouchable was brought down not just by the law, but by the very system he created. One built on fragile loyalties and constant danger. The legend remains, but the man is a warning of the cost of a life built on crime. Curtis Warren's story didn't end with his prison sentence or the collapse of his empire. Even behind bars, his name continued to echo through the criminal underworld and the media. Years passed, but his influence, reputation, and legacy lingered. For some, he remained a symbol of power and cunning. A man who had risen from nothing to control vast international drug networks. For others, he was a reminder of the devastation drugs bring to communities and families. His life inspired fear, fascination, and endless speculation. Despite being locked away, Warren's story sparked questions that still remain unanswered. How much of his fortune was ever truly recovered? Were some parts of his empire still active, run by those he trusted? And could he ever regain power once released? The mystery added to the legend. Authorities remained vigilant, knowing that figures like Warren rarely disappear quietly. The tale of Curtis Warren also highlighted the complex world of drug trafficking, a dangerous game where power, money, and violence intersect. His rise showed how desperation and ambition can push someone to extraordinary lengths. His fall revealed the relentless efforts of law enforcement to break down criminal networks, no matter how sophisticated. Today, Warren serves as a case study for police, lawyers, and policymakers trying to understand and combat organized crime. His life shows both the possibilities and limitations of criminal empires. He was a man who mastered the art of secrecy and strategy, but ultimately couldn't escape the consequences of his actions. His journey from a poor Liverpool neighborhood to becoming one of Europe's most notorious drug lords is a story of ambition, risk, and the dark side of success. It's a reminder that behind every headline is a complex human story, one filled with choices, consequences, and regrets. Curtis Warren's legacy remains complicated. Some may see him as a criminal mastermind, others as a tragic figure shaped by